5. On the second and final day of their descent into the down deep, the novel gradually became the habitual. The clunk and thrum of the great spiral staircase found a rhythm. Jean's was able to lose herself in her thoughts, daydreaming so serenely that she would glance up at the floor number, 72, 84, and wonder where a dozen landings went. The kink in her left knee was even soothed away, whether by the numbness of fatigue or an actual return to health she didn't know. She took to using the walking stick less, finding it only held up her pace as it often slipped between the treads and got caught there. With it tucked under her arm, it felt more useful, like another bone in her skeleton, holding her together. When they passed the 90th floor, with the stench of fertilizer and the pigs and other animals that produced this useful waste, Jean's pressed on, skipping the tour and lunch she'd planned, thinking only briefly of the small rabbit that somehow had escaped from another farm, made it 20 floors up without being spotted, and ate its fill for 3 weeks while it confounded half a silo. Technically, they were already in the down deep when they reached 97, the bottom third. But even though the silo was mathematically divided into 3 sections of 48 floors each, her brain didn't work that way. Floor 100 was a better demarcation. It was a milestone. She counted the floors down until they reached the first landing with 3 digits and stopped for a break. Marnes was breathing deeply, she noticed, but she felt great. Alive and renewed in the way she had hoped the trip would make her. The futility, dread, and exhaustion from the day before were gone. All that remained was a small twinge of fear that these dour feelings could return, that this exuberant elation was a temporary high, that if she stopped, if she thought on it too long, it would spiral away and leave her dark and moody once more. They split a small loaf of bread between them, sitting on the metal grating of the wide landing with their elbows propped up on the railings, their feet swinging over empty space, like 2 kids cutting class. Level 100 teemed with people coming and going. The entire floor was a bazaar, a place for exchanging goods, for cashing in work chits for whatever was needed or merely coveted. Workers with their trailing shadows came and went. Families yelled for one another among the dizzying crowds. Merchants barked their best deals. The doors remained propped open for the traffic, letting the smells and sounds drift out onto the double-wide landing, the grating shivering with excitement. Jean's reveled in the anonymity of the passing crowd. She bit into her half of the loaf, savoring the fresh yeastiness of bread baked that morning, and felt like just another person, a younger person. Marnes cut her a piece of cheese and a slice of apple and sandwiched them together. His hand touched hers as he passed it to her. Even the breadcrumbs in his mustache were part of the moment's perfection.
"We're way ahead of schedule,"
Marnes said before taking a bite of fruit. It was just a pleasant observation, a pat on their elderly backs.
"I figure we'll hit 140 by dinner."
"Right now, I'm not even dreading the climb out," Jean said. She finished the cheese and apple and chewed contentedly. Everything tasted better while climbing, she decided. Or in pleasant company, or amid the music leaking out of the bazaar, some beggar strumming his uke over the noise of the crowd. "Why don't we come down here more often?" she asked.
Marnes grunted. "'Cause it's 100 flights down? Besides, we've got the view, the lounge, the bar at Kipper's. How many of these people come up to any of that more than once every few years?"
Jean's chewed on that, and on her last bite of bread. "Do you think it's natural, not wandering too far from where we live?"
"I don't follow,"
Marnes said, around a bite of food. "Pretend, just as a hypothetical, mind you, that people lived in those ancient above-ground silos poking up over the hillside. You don't think they would move around so little, do you?
Like stay in the same silo? Never wander over here or up and down 100 flights of stairs?" "I don't think on those things," Marnes said. Jean's took it as a hint that she shouldn't either. It was impossible sometimes to know what could and couldn't be said about the outside. Those were discussions for spouses, and maybe the walk and the day together yesterday had gotten to her. Or maybe she was as susceptible to the post-cleaning high as anyone else. That sense that rules could be relaxed, temptations courted, the lack of pressure and the waste of a double cleaning giving excuse for a month of jubilant wiggling in one's own skin. "Should we get going?" Jean asked as Marnes finished his bread. He nodded, and they stood and collected their things. A woman walking by turned and stared, a flash of recognition on her face, gone as she hurried to catch up to her children. It was like another world down here, Jean thought to herself. She had gone too long without a visit, and even as she promised herself to not let that happen again, some part of her knew, like a rusting machine that could feel its age, that this journey would be her last. Floors passed without care. The lower gardens, the larger farm on the 130s, the pungent water treatment plant below. Jean's found herself lost in thought, thinking on her conversation with Marnes the night before, the idea of Donald living with her more in memory than reality, when she came to the gate at 1:40. She hadn't even noticed the change in traffic, the preponderance of blue denim coveralls, the porters with more satchels of parts and tools than clothes, food, or personal deliveries. But the crowd at the gate showed her that she'd arrived at the upper levels of mechanical. Gathered at the entrance were workers in loose blue coveralls spotted with age-old stains. Jean's could nearly peg their professions by the tools they carried. The thought of climbing so many flights of stairs and then having to work boggled her mind. And then she remembered she was about to do that very thing. Rather than abuse her station or Marnes's power, they waited in line while the workers checked through the gate. As these tired men and women signed back in and logged their travel and hours, Jean's realized the time she had wasted ruminating about her own life during the long descent, time she should have spent polishing her appeal to this Juliet. Rare nerves twisted her gut as the line shuffled forward. The worker ahead of them showed his ID, the card colored blue for mechanical. He scratched his information on a dusty slate. When it was their turn, they pushed through the outer gate and showed their golden IDs. The station guard raised his eyebrows, then seemed to recognize the mayor. "Your Honor," he said, and Jean's didn't correct him. "Weren't expecting you this shift." He waved their IDs away and reached for a nub of chalk. "Here, let me." Jean's watched as he spun the board around and wrote their names in neat print, the side of his palm collecting dust from the old film of chalk below. For Marnes, he simply wrote Sheriff, and again Jean's didn't correct him. "I know she wasn't expecting us until later," Jean said, "but I wonder if we could meet with Juliet Nichols now." The station guard turned and looked behind him at the digital clock that recorded the proper time. "She won't be off the generator for another hour, maybe 2, knowing her. You could hit the mess hall and wait." Jean's looked to Marnes, who shrugged. "Not entirely hungry yet," he said.
"What about seeing her at work? It would be nice to see what she does. We try our best to stay out of the way."
The guard lifted his shoulders.
"Well, you're the mayor. I can't say no."
He jabbed the nub of chalk down the hall, the people lined up outside the gate shifting impatiently as they waited.
"See Knox. He'll get someone to run you down."
Knox was a man hard to miss. He amply filled the largest set of coveralls Jean's had ever seen. She wondered if the extra denim cost him more chits, and how a man managed to keep such a belly full. A thick beard added to his scope. If he smiled or frowned at their approach, it was impossible to know. He was as unmoved as a wall of concrete. Jean's explained what they were after. Marnes said hello, and she realized they must have met the last time he was down. Knox listened, nodded, and then bellowed in a voice so gruff the words were indistinguishable from one another. But they meant something to someone, as a young boy materialized from behind him, a waif of a kid with unusually bright orange hair.
"Get him off from down the jewels,"
Knox growled, the space between the words as slender as the gap in his beard where a mouth should have been. The young boy, young even for a shadow, waved his hand and darted away. Marnes thanked Knox, who didn't budge, and they followed after the boy. The corridors in Mechanical, Jean saw, were even tighter than elsewhere in the silo. They squeezed through the end-of-shift traffic, the concrete blocks on either side primed but not painted, and rough where they brushed against her shoulder. Overhead, parallel and twisting runs of pipe and wire conduit hung exposed. Jean's felt the urge to duck, despite the half-foot of clearance. She did notice many of the taller workers walking with a stoop. The lights overhead were dim and spaced well apart, making the sensation of tunneling deeper and deeper into the earth overwhelming. The young shadow with the orange hair led them around several turns, his confidence in the route seemingly habitual. They came to a flight of stairs, the square kind that made right turns, and went down 2 more levels. Jean's heard a rumbling grow louder as they descended. When they left the stairwell on 142, they passed an odd contraption in a wide open room just off the hallway. A steel arm, the size of several people end to end, was lifting up and down, driving a piston through the concrete floor. Jean slowed to watch its rhythmic gyrations. The air smelled of something chemical, something rotten. She couldn't place it.
"Is this a generator?"
Marnes laughed in a patronizing, uniquely manly way.
"Oh, well, that's a pump,"
he said.
"Oil well. It's how you read at night."
He squeezed her shoulder as he walked past, and Jean's forgave him instantly for laughing at her. She hurried after him and Knox's young shadow.
"The generator is that thrumming you hear,"
Marnes said.
"The pump brings up oil. They do something to it in a plant a few floors down, and then it's ready to burn."
Jean's vaguely knew some of this, possibly from a committee meeting. She was amazed, once again, at how much of the silo was alien to even her, she who was supposed to be, nominally at least, running things. The persistent grumbling in the walls grew louder as they neared the end of the hall. When the boy with the orange hair pulled up the doors, the sonic blast was immediate. Jean's felt wary about approaching further, and even Marnes seemed to stall. The kid waved them forward with frantic gestures, and Jean's found herself willing her feet to carry her toward the noise. She wondered, suddenly, if they were being led outside. It was an illogical, senseless idea, born of imagining the most dangerous threat she could possibly summon. As she broke the plane of the door, cowering behind Marnes, the boy let the door slam shut, trapping them inside with the onslaught. He pulled headphones, no wires dangling from them, from a rack by the wall. Jean's followed his lead and put a pair over her own ears. The noise deadened, remaining only in her chest and nerve endings. She wondered why, for what cause, this rack of ear protection would be located inside the room rather than outside. The boy waved and said something, but it was just moving lips. They followed along a narrow passageway of steel grating, a floor much like the landings on each silo floor. When the hallway turned, one wall fell away and was replaced with a railing of 3 horizontal bars. Beyond, a machine beyond reckoning loomed. It was the size of her entire apartment and office put together, in a room larger than many in the gardens. Nothing seemed to be moving at first, nothing to justify the pounding she could feel in her chest and across her skin. It wasn't until they fully rounded the machine that she saw the steel rod sticking out of the back of the unit, spinning ferociously and disappearing into another massive metal machine which had cables as thick as a man's waist rising up toward the ceiling. The power and energy in the room were palpable. As they reached the end of the second machine, Jean finally saw a solitary figure working beside it. A young-looking woman in coveralls, a hard hat on, brown braided hair hanging out the back, was leaning into a wrench nearly as long as she was tall. Her presence gave the machines a terrifying sense of scale, but she didn't seem to fear them. She threw herself into her wrench, her body frightfully close to the roaring unit, reminding Jean of an old children's tale where a mouse pulled a barb out of an imaginary beast called an elephant. The idea of a woman this size fixing a machine of such ferocity seemed absurd. But she watched the woman work while the young shadow slipped through a gate and ran up to tug on her coveralls. The woman turned, not startled, and squinted at Jean's and Marne's. She wiped her forehead with the back of one hand, her other hand swinging the wrench around to rest on her shoulder. She patted the young shadow on the head and walked out to meet them. Jean saw that the woman's arms were lean and defined with muscle. She wore no undershirt, just blue coveralls cut high up over her chest, exposing a bit of olive skin that gleamed with sweat. She had the same dark complexion as the farmers who worked under grow lights, but it could have been as much from the grease and grime if her denims were any indication. She stopped short of Jean's and Marne's and nodded at them. She smiled at Marne's with a hint of recognition. She didn't offer her hand, for which Jean's was grateful. Instead, she pointed towards a door by a glass partition and then headed that way herself. Marne's followed on her heels like a puppy, Jean's close behind. She turned to make sure the shadow wasn't underfoot, only to see him scurrying off the way he had come, his hair glowing in the wan overhead lights of the generator room. His duty, as far as he was concerned, was done. Inside the small control room, the noise lessened. It dropped almost to nothing as the thick door was shut tight. Juliet pulled off her hard hat and earmuffs and dropped them on a shelf. Jean's took hers away from her head tentatively, heard the noise reduced to a distant hum, and removed them all the way. The room was tight and crowded with metal surfaces and winking lights, unlike anything she had ever seen. It was strange to her that she was mayor of this room as well, a thing she hardly knew existed and certainly couldn't operate. While the ringing in Jean's ears subsided, Juliet adjusted some spinning knobs, watching little arms waver under glass shields. "I thought we were doing this tomorrow morning," she said. She concentrated intently on her work.
We made better time than I'd hoped."
Jean's looked to Marne's, who was holding his ear protection in both hands, shifting uncomfortably.
"Good to see you again, Jules," he said.
She nodded and leaned down to peer through the thick glass window at the gargantuan machines outside, her hands darting over the large control board without needing to look, adjusting large black dials with faded white markings. "Sorry about your partner," she said, glancing down at a bank of readouts. She turned and studied Marne's, and Jean saw that this woman, beneath the sweat and grime, was beautiful. Her face was hard and lean, her eyes bright. She had a fierce intelligence you could measure from a distance, and she peered at Marne's with utmost sympathy, visible in the furrow of her brows. "Really," she said, "I'm terribly sorry. He seemed like a good man."
"The best," Marne sputtered, his voice cracking.
Juliet nodded, as if that was all that needed saying. She turned to Jean's. "The vibration you feel in the floor, Mayor? That's a coupling when it's barely 2 millimeters off. If you think it feels bad in here, you should go put your hands on the casing. It'll jiggle your fingers numb immediately. Hold it long enough and your bones will rattle like you're coming apart." She turned and reached between John's and Marne's to throw a massive switch, then turned back to the control board. Now, imagine what the generator is going through, shaking itself to pieces like that. Teeth start grinding together in the transmission. Small bits of metal shaving cycle through the oil like sandpaper grit. Next thing you know, there's an explosion of steel and we've got no power but whatever the backup can spit out. Jean's held her breath.
You need us to get someone?
Marnes asked. Juliet laughed. None of this is news or different from any other shift. If the backup unit wasn't being torn down for new gaskets and we could go to half power for a week, I could pull that coupler, adjust the mounts, and have her spinning like a top. She shot a look at John's. But since we have a mandate for full power, no interruptions, that's not happening. So I'm going to keep tightening bolts while they keep trying to shake loose and try to find the right revolutions in here to keep her fairly singing.
Well, I had no idea when I signed that mandate.
And here I thought I'd dumb down my report enough to make it clear, Juliet said.
Well, how long before this failure happens?
Jean suddenly realized she wasn't here interviewing this woman. The demands were heading the opposite direction. How long? Juliet laughed and shook her head. She finished a final adjustment and turned to face them with her arms. It could happen right now. It could happen 100 years from now. The point is, it's going to happen, and it's entirely preventable. The goal shouldn't be to keep this place humming along for our lifetimes. She looked pointedly at John's. Or our current term. If the goal ain't forever, we should pack our bags right now. Jean saw Marnes stiffen at this. She felt her own body react, a chill coursing across her skin. This last line was dangerously close to treason. The metaphor only half saved it.
Well, I could declare a power holiday, Jean suggested. We could stage it in memory of those who clean.
She thought more about this.
It could be an excuse to service more than your machine here. We could...
Good luck getting IT to power down shit, Juliet said. She wiped her chin with the back of her wrist, then wiped this on her coveralls. She looked down at the grease transferred to the denim. Pardon my language, Mayor. Jean's wanted to tell her that it was quite all right, but the woman's attitude, her power, reminded her too much of a former self that she could just barely recall. A younger woman who dispensed with niceties and got what she wanted. She found herself glancing at Marnes.
Why do you single out their department? For the power, I mean.
Juliet laughed and uncrossed her arms. She tossed her hands toward the ceiling. Why? Because IT has, 3 floors out of 144? And yet they use up over a quarter of all the power we produce. I can do the math for you.
Oh, that's quite all right.
And I don't remember a server ever feeding someone or saving someone's life or stitching up a hole in their britches. Jean smiled. She suddenly saw what Marnes liked about this woman. She also saw what he had once seen in her younger self, before she married his best friend.
But what if we had IT ratchet down for some maintenance on their own for a week? Would that work?
I thought we came down here to recruit her away from all this,
Marnes grumbled. Juliet shot him a look. And I thought I told your secretary not to bother. Not that I've got anything against what you do, but I'm needed down here. She raised her arm and checked something dangling from her wrist. It was a timepiece, but she was studying it as if it still worked. Look, I'd love to chat more. She looked up at Jean's. Especially if you can guarantee a holiday from the juice, but I've got a few more adjustments to make and I'm already into my overtime. Knox gets pissed if I push into too many extra shifts.
We'll get out of your hair, Jean said. We haven't had dinner yet, so maybe we can see you after, once you punch out and get cleaned up.
Juliet looked down at herself as if to confirm she even needed cleaning. Yeah, sure, she said. They've got you in the bunkhouse? Marnes nodded. All right, I'll find you later, and don't forget your muffs. She pointed to her ears, looked Marnes in the eye, nodded, then returned to her work, letting them know the conversation, for now, was over. 6. Marnes and Jeans finished their meals, which consisted of large bowls of soup and hunks of dry, almost stale bread, and exited a mess hall nearly as noisy as the generator room. During the entire meal, Jeans had regretted not bringing those plastic and foam ear protection muffs to dinner. The men and women of Mechanical were as loud and boisterous as they were filthy. She wondered if perhaps they all yelled because they were going deaf in the constant hammering of the place. Outside, they followed Knox's directions to the bunkroom, where they found a cot made up for Marnes and one of the attached private rooms reserved for Jeans. They bided their time in the small room, rubbing aches in their legs, talking about how different the Down Deep was, until there was a knock on their door and Juliet pushed it open and stepped inside. "They got you both in one room?" she asked, surprised. Jeans laughed. "Oh, no, they've got a bunk set aside as well, and I would have been happy staying out there with the others." "Oh, forget it," Juliet said. "They put up recruits and visiting families in here all the time." Jeans watched as Juliet placed a length of string in her mouth, then gathered her hair, still wet from a shower, and tied it up in a tail. She had changed into another pair of coveralls, and Jeans guessed the stains in them were permanent, that the fabric was actually laundered and ready for another shift. "So, how soon could we announce this power holiday?" Juliet asked. She finished her knot and crossed her arms, leaning back against the wall beside the door. "I would think you'd want to take advantage of the post-cleaning mood, right?" "Well, how soon can you start?" Jeans asked. She realized, suddenly, that part of the reason she wanted this woman as her sheriff was that she felt unattainable. Jeans glanced over at Marnes and wondered how much of his attraction to her, all those many years ago, when she was young and with Donald, had been as simply motivated. "Well, I can start tomorrow," Juliet said. "We could have the backup generator online by morning. I could work another shift tonight to make sure the gaskets and seals—" "No," Jeans said, raising her hand. "How soon can you start as sheriff?" She dug through her open bag, sorting folders across the bed, looking for the contract. I thought we discussed this. I have no interest in being—"
"Well, they make the best ones," Marnes said. "The ones who have no interest in it."
He stood across from Juliet, his thumbs tucked into his coveralls, leaning against one of the small apartment's walls. "I'm sorry, but there's no one down here who can just slip into my boots," Juliet said, shaking her head. "I don't think you two understand all that we do."
"I don't think you understand what we do up top," Jean said, "or why we need you."
Juliet tossed her head and laughed. "Look, I've got machines down here that you can't possibly—"
"And what good are they?" Jean asked. "What do these machines do?"
"Well, they keep this whole goddamn place running," Juliet declared. "The oxygen you breathe, we recycle that down here. The toxins you exhale, we pump them back into the earth. You want me to write up a list of everything oil makes? Every piece of plastic, every ounce of rubber, all the solvents and cleaners? And I'm not talking about the power it generates, but everything else?"
"And yet, it was all here before you were born," Jean pointed out.
"Well, it wouldn't have lasted my lifetime, I'll tell you that. Not in the state it was in." She crossed her arms again and leaned back against the wall. "I don't think you get what mess we'd be in without these machines."
"And I don't think you get how pointless these machines are going to become without all these people."
Juliet looked away. It was the first time Jean had seen her flinch.
"Why don't you ever visit your father?"
Juliet snapped her head around and looked at the other wall. She wiped loose hair back on her forehead. "Go look at my work log," she said. "Tell me when I'd fit it in." Before Jean could reply, could say that it was family, that there's always time, Juliet turned to face her. "Do you think I don't care about people? Is that it? Because you'd be wrong. I care about every person in this silo. And the men and women down here, the forgotten 8 floors of Mechanical, this is my family. I visit with them every day. I break bread with them several times a day. We work, live, and die alongside one another. She looked to Marnes. Isn't that right? You've seen it. Marnes didn't say anything. Jean's wondered if she was referring specifically to the dying part. Did you ask him why he never comes to see me? Because he has all the time in the world. He has nothing up there.
Yes, we met with him. Your father seemed like a very busy man, as determined as you.
Juliet looked away.
And as stubborn.
Jean left the paperwork on the bed and went to stand by the door, just a pace away from Juliet. She could smell the soap in the younger woman's hair, could see her nostrils flare with her rapid, heavy breathing.
The days pile up and weigh small decisions down, don't they? That decision to not visit. The first few days slide by easy enough. Anger and youth powers them along. But then they pile up like unrecycled trash. Isn't that right?
Juliet waved her hand. I don't know what you're talking about.
I'm talking about days becoming weeks, becoming months, becoming years.
She almost said that she'd been through the exact same thing, was still piling them up, but Marnes was in the room, listening.
After a while, you're staying mad just to justify an old mistake. Then it's just a game. Two people staring away, refusing to look back over their shoulders, afraid to be the first one to take that chance.
It wasn't like that, Juliet said. I don't want your job. I'm sure you've got plenty of others who do.
If it's not you, it's someone I'm not sure I can trust. Not anymore.
Then give it to the next girl, she smiled.
It's you or him. And I think he'll be getting more guidance from the 30s than he will from me or from the Pact.
Juliet seemed to react to this. Her arms loosened across her chest. She turned and met Jean's gaze. Marnes was studying all of this from across the room. That last sheriff, Holston, what happened to him?
Well, he went to cleaning, Jean said.
He volunteered,
Marnes added, gruffly. I know, but why? She frowned. I heard it was his wife.
Well, there's all kinds of speculation.
I remember him talking about her. When you two came down to look into Rick's death, I thought at first that he was flirting with me, but all he could talk about was this wife of his.
Well, they were in the lottery while we were down here,
Marnes reminded her. Yeah, that's right. She studied the bed for a while. Paperwork was spread across it. I wouldn't know how to do this job. I only know how to fix things.
Well, it's the same thing, Marnes told her. You were a big help with our case down here. You see how things work, how they fit together, little clues that other people miss.
You're talking about machines, she said.
Well, people aren't much different,
Marnes told her.
I think you already know this, Jean said. I think you have the right attitude, actually, the right disposition. This is only slightly a political office. Distance is good.
Juliet shook her head and looked back to Marnes. So you nominated me for this, is that it? I wondered how this came up. It seemed like something right out of the ground.
Or you'd be good at it, Marnes told her. I think you'd be damn good at anything you set your mind to, and this is more important work than you'd think.
And I'd live up top?
Your office is on level 1, near the airlock.
Juliet seemed to mull this over. Jean's was excited to have her even asking questions.
Well, the pay is more than you're making now, even with the extra shifts.
You checked? Jean's nodded.
I took some liberties before we came down.
Like talking to my father?
Well, that's right. He would love to see you, if you came with us.
Juliet looked down at her boots. Not sure about that.
Well, there's one other thing,
Marnes said, catching Jean's eye. He glanced at the paperwork on the bed. The crisply folded contract for Peter Billings was on top.
IT,
he reminded her. Jean's caught his drift.
There's one matter to clear up before you accept.
Well, I'm not sure I'm accepting. I'd want to hear more about this power holiday, organize the work shifts down here.
According to tradition, IT signs off on all nominated positions.
Juliet rolled her eyes and blew out her breath. IT.
Yes, and we checked in with them on the way down as well, just to smooth things over.
I'm sure, Juliet said.
It's about these requisitions,
Marnes interjected.
Juliet turned to him.
We know it probably ain't nothing, but it's gonna come up.
Wait, is this about the heat tape?
Heat tape?
Yeah. Juliet frowned and shook her head. Oh, those bastards.
Jean's pinched 2 inches of air. They had a folder on you this thick, said you were skimming supplies meant for them.
No, they didn't. Are you kidding? She pointed toward the door. We can't get any of the supplies we need because of them. When I needed heat tape, we had a leak in a heat exchanger a few months back. We couldn't get any because supply tells us the backing material for the tape is all spoken for. Now, we had that order in a while back, and then I find out from one of our porters that the tape is going to IT, that they've got miles of the stuff for the skins of all their test suits.
Juliet took a deep breath.
So, I had some intercepted.
She looked to Marnes as she admitted this.
Look, I'm keeping the power on so they can do whatever it is they do up there, and I can't get basic supplies. Even when I do, the quality is complete crap. Probably because of unrealistic quotas, rushing the manufacturing chain.
If these are items you really need, Jean's interrupted, then I understand. She looked to Marnes, who smiled and dipped his chin as if to say he told her this was the right woman for the job. Jean's ignored him. I'm actually glad to hear your side of things, she told Juliet. And I wish I made this trip more often, as sore as my legs are. There are things we take for granted up top, mostly because they aren't well understood. I can see now that our offices need to be in better communication, have more of the constant contact I have with IT.
I've been saying that for just about 20 years, Juliet said.
Down here, we joke that this place was laid out to keep us well out of the way.
And that's how it feels sometimes.
Well, if you come up top, if you take this job, people will hear you. You could be the first link in that chain of command.
Where would IT fall?
Well, there will be resistance, but that's normal with them. I've handled it before. I'll wire my office for some emergency waivers. We'll make them retroactive, get these acquisitions above board.
Jean studied the younger woman.
As long as I have your assurance that every one of these diverted supplies was absolutely necessary.
Juliet did not flinch away from the challenge.
They were, she said. Not that it mattered. The stuff we got from them was crap. Couldn't have fallen apart better if it'd been designed to.
I'll tell you what, we finally got our shipment from supply and have extra tape. I would love to drop off a peace offering on our way up. Our design is so much better.
Our way up? Jean's asked, making sure she understood what she was saying, what she was agreeing to.
Juliet looked them both over. She nodded. Well, you'll have to give me a week to sort out the generator. I'm holding you to that power holiday. And just so you understand, I'll always consider myself mechanical, and I'll be doing this partly because I see what happens when problems are ignored. My big push down here has been preventative maintenance. No more waiting for things to break before we fix them, but to go around and make them hum while they're still working. Too many issues have been ignored, let degrade. And I think if the silo can be thought of as one big engine, we are like the dirty oil pan down here that needs some people's attention. She reached her hand out to Jean's. Get me that power holiday, and I'm your man. Jean smiled and took her hand, admiring the warmth and power in her confident handshake.
Well, I'll get on it first thing in the morning, she said. And thank you. Welcome aboard.
Marnes crossed the room to shake Juliet's hand as well.
Nice to have you on, boss.
Juliet smirked as she took his hand. Well, now, let's not get ahead of ourselves. I think I'll have a lot to learn before you go calling me that. Seven. It felt appropriate that their climb back to the uptop would occur during a power holiday. Jean's could feel her own energy complying with the new decree, draining away with each laborious step. The agony of the descent had been a tease, the discomfort of constant movement disguising itself as the fatigue of exercise. But now her frail muscles were really put to work. Each step was something to be conquered. She would lift a boot to the next tread, place a hand on her knee, and push herself another 10 inches up what felt like 1,000,000 feet of spiral staircase. The landing to her right displayed the number 58. Each landing seemed to be in view forever, not like the trip down, where she could daydream and skip right past several floors. Now they loomed in sight gradually beyond the outer railing and held there, taunting in the dim green glow of the emergency lights as she struggled up one plodding and wavering step at a time. Marnes walked beside her, his hand on the inner rail, hers on the outer, the walking stick clanging on the lonely treads between them. Occasionally, their arms brushed against one another. It felt as though they'd been away for months, away from their offices, their duties, their cold familiarity. The adventure down to wrangle a new sheriff had played out differently than Jean's had imagined it would. She had dreamed of a return to her youth, and had instead found herself haunted by old ghosts. She had hoped to find a renewed vigor, and instead felt the years of wear in her knees and back. What was to be a grand tour of her silo was instead trudged in relative anonymity, and now she wondered if its operation and upkeep even needed her. The world around her was stratified. She saw that ever more clearly. The up-top concerned itself with a blurring view, taking for granted the squeezed juice enjoyed with breakfast. The people who lived below and worked the gardens or cleaned animal cages orbited their own world of soil, greenery, and fertilizer. To them, the outside view was peripheral, ignored until there was a cleaning. And then there was the down deep, the machine shops and chemistry labs, the pumping oil and grinding gears, the hands-on world of grease-limbed fingers and the musk of toil. To these people, the outside world and the food that trickled down were mere rumors and bodily sustenance. The point of the silo was for the people to keep the machines running, when Jean's had always, her entire life, seen it the other way around. Landing 57 appeared through the fog of darkness. A young girl sat on the steel grate, her feet tucked up against herself, arms wrapped around her knees, a children's book in its protective plastic cover held out into the feeble light spilling from an overhead bulb. Jean's watched the girl, who was unmoved save her eyes as they darted over the colorful pages. The girl never looked up to see who was passing the apartment's landing. They left her behind, and she gradually faded in the darkness as Jean's and Marnes struggled ever upward, exhausted from their 3rd day of climbing. No vibrations or ringing footsteps above or below them. The silo, quiet and eerily devoid of life. Room enough for 2 old friends, 2 comrades, to walk side by side on the crumbling steps of chipping paint, their arms swinging and every now and then, and very occasionally, brushing together. They stayed that night at the mid-level deputy station, the officer of the mids insisting they take his hospitality, and Jean's eager to buttress support for yet another sheriff nominated from outside the profession. After a cold dinner in near darkness and enough idle banter to satisfy their host and his wife, Jean's retired to the main office, where a convertible couch had been made as comfortable as possible, the linens borrowed from a nicer elsewhere and smelling of two-chit soap. Marnes had been set up on a cot in the holding cell, which still smelled of tub gin and a drunk who had gotten too carried away after the cleaning. It was impossible to notice when the lights went out. They were so dim already. Jean's rested on the cot in the darkness, her muscles throbbing and luxuriating in her body's stillness, her feet cramped and feeling like solid bone, her back tender and in need of stretching. Her mind, however, continued to move. It drifted back to the weary conversations that had passed the time on their most recent day of climbing. She and Marn seemed to be spiraling around one another, testing the memory of old attractions, probing the tenderness of ancient scars, looking for some soft spot that remained among brittle and broken bodies, across wrinkled and dried paper skin, and within hearts calloused by law and politics. Donald's name came up often and tentatively, like a child sneaking into the adult bed, forcing wary lovers to make room in the middle. Jean's grieved anew for her long-lost husband. She grieved for the first time in her life for the subsequent decades of solitude. What she had forever seen as her calling, this living apart and serving the greater good, now felt more a curse. Her life had been taken from her, squeezed into pulp. The juice of her efforts and sacrificed years had dripped down through a silo that, just 40 levels below her, hardly knew and barely cared. The saddest part of this journey had been this understanding she'd come to with Holston's ghost. She could admit it now, a great reason for her hike, perhaps even the reason for wanting Juliet as sheriff, was to fall all the way to the down deep, away from the sad sight of two lovers nestled together in the crook of a hill as the wind etched away all their wasted youth. She had set out to escape Holston, and had instead found him. Now she knew, if not the mystery of why all sent out to clean actually did so, why a sad few would dare volunteer for the duty. Better to join a ghost than be haunted by them, Jean's now knew. Better no life than an empty one. The door to the deputy's office squeaked on a hinge long worn beyond the repair of grease. Jean's tried to sit up, to see in the dark, but her muscles were too sore, her eyes too old. She wanted to call out, to let her hosts know that she was okay, in need of nothing, but she listened instead. Footsteps came to her, nearly invisible in the worn carpet. There were no words, just the creaking of old joints as they approached the bed, the lifting of expensive and fragrant sheets, and an understanding between two living ghosts. Jean's breath caught in her chest. Her hand groped for a wrist as it clutched her sheets. She slid over on the small convertible bed to make room and pulled him down beside her. Marnes wrapped his arms around her back, wiggled beneath her until she was lying on his side, a leg draped over his, her hands on his neck. She felt his mustache brush against her cheek, heard his lips purse and peck the corner of hers. Jean's held his cheeks and burrowed her face into his shoulder. She cried, like a schoolchild, like a new shadow who felt lost and afraid in the wilderness of a strange and terrifying job. She cried with fear, but that soon drained away. It drained like the soreness in her back as his hands rubbed her there. It drained until numbness found its place, and then, after what felt like a forever of shuddering sobs, with sensation taking the place of that. Jean's felt alive in her skin. She felt the tingle of flesh touching flesh, of just her forearm against his hard ribs, her hands on his shoulder, his hands on her hips. And then the tears were some joyous release, some welcomed sadness of a moment long delayed and finally there, arms wrapped around it and holding tight. She fell asleep like that, exhausted from far more than the climb, nothing more than a few trembling kisses, hands interlocking, a whispered word of tenderness and appreciation, and then the depths of sleep pulling her down, the weariness in her joints and bones succumbing to a slumber she didn't want but sorely needed. She slept with a man in her arms for the first time in decades. and woke to a bed familiarly empty, but a heart strangely full. In the middle of their fourth and final day of climbing, they approached the mid-30s of IT. Jean's had found herself taking more breaks for water and to rub her muscles along the way, not for the exhaustion she feigned, but the dread of this stopover and seeing Bernard, the fear of their trip ever coming to an end. The dark and deep shadows cast by the power holiday followed them up, the traffic sparse as most merchants had closed for the silo-wide brownout. Juliet, who had stayed behind to oversee the repairs, had warned Jean's of the flickering lights from the backup generator. Still, the effect of the shimmering illumination had worn on her during the long climb. The inconstancy was bothersome. When they reached the 34th, Jean's felt like they were, in a sense, home again. Back in the realm of the familiar, at the main landing for IT. She waited by the railing, leaning on it and her walking stick, while Marnes got the door. As it was cracked open, the pale glow of diminished power was swept off the stairwell by the bright lights blooming inside. It hadn't been widely publicized, but the reason for the severe power restrictions on other levels was largely due to the exemption IT maintained it possessed in spite of this holiday. Bernard had pointed to various clauses in the pact to support this. Juliet had bitched that servers shouldn't get priority over grow lights, but resigned herself to getting the main generator realigned and taking what she could. Jean's told Juliet to view this as her first lesson in political compromise. Juliet said she saw it as a display of weakness. Inside, Jean's found Bernard waiting on them, a look on his face like he'd swallowed sour fruit juice. A conversation between several IT workers standing off to the side quickly silenced with their entry, leaving Jean's little doubt that they'd been spotted on the way up and expected. "Bernard," she said, trying to keep her breathing steady. She didn't want him to know how tired she was. Let him think she was strolling by on her way up from the down deep, like it was no big deal.
"Marie."
It was a deliberate slight. He didn't even look Marnes's way or acknowledge that the deputy was in the room.
"Would you like to sign these here or in the conference room?"
She dug into her bag for the contract with Juliet's name on it.
"What games are you playing at, Marie?"
Jean's felt her temperature rise. The cluster of workers in silver IT jumpsuits were following the exchange.
"Playing at?" she asked. "You think this power holiday of yours is cute? Your way of getting back at me?"
"Getting back?"
"I've got servers, Marie."
"Your servers have their full allocation of power," Jean's reminded him, her voice rising.
"But their cooling comes ducted from mechanical, and if temps get any higher, we'll be ramping down, which we've never had to do."
Marnes stepped between the two of them, his hands raised.
"Easy,"
he said, coolly, his gaze on Bernard.
"Call off your little shadow here,"
Bernard said. Jean's placed a hand on Marnes's arm.
"The pact is clear, Bernard. It's my choice, my nomination. You and I have a nice history of signing off on each other's, and I told you this girl from the pits will not do."
"Well, she's got the job,"
Marnes said, interrupting. Jean's noticed his hand had fallen to the butt of his gun. She wasn't sure if Bernard noticed or not, but he fell silent. His eyes, however, did not leave Jean's.
"I won't sign it."
"Well, then next time I won't ask." Bernard smiled.
"You think you'll outlive another sheriff?"
He turned toward the workers in the corner and waved one of them over.
"Why do I somehow doubt that?"
The worker approached. Bernard nodded to the young man, a face familiar to Jean's from level meetings.
"Sign whatever she needs. I refuse to. Make copies. Take care of the rest."
He waved his hand dismissively, turned and looked Marnes and Jean's up and down one final time, as if disgusted with their condition, their age, their positions, something.
"Oh, and top off their canteens and see that they have enough food to stagger back to their homes.
whatever it takes to power their decrepit legs to wherever it is that they belong."
And with that, Bernard strode off toward the barred gates that led into the heart of IT, back to his brightly lit offices where servers hummed happily, the temperature rising in the slow-moving air like the heat of angered flesh as capillaries squeezed, the blood in them rising to a boil. Eight. The floors flew by faster as they approached home. In the darkest sections of the staircase, between quiet floors of people hunkered down and awaiting a return to normalcy, old hands wrapped around each other and swung between two climbers, brazenly and open, grasping each other while their other hands slid up the cool steel of the rails. Jean's only let go sporadically to check that her walking stick was secure against her back, or to grab Marnes's canteen from his pack and take a sip. They had taken to drinking each other's water, it being easier to reach across than around one's own back. There was a sweetness to it as well, this carrying the sustenance another needed, this being able to provide and reciprocate in a perfectly equitable relationship. It was a thing worth dropping hands for, momentarily at least. Jean's finished a sip, screwed on the metal cap with its dangling chain, and replaced it in his outer pouch. She was dying to know if things would be different once they got back. They were only 20 floors away. An impossible distance yesterday now seemed like something that could slip away without noticing. And as they arrived, would familiar surroundings bring familiar roles? Would last night feel more and more like a dream? Or would old ghosts become more and more solid? She wanted to ask these things, but talked of trivialities instead. When would Jules, as she insisted they call her, be ready for duty? What case files did he and Holston have open that needed tending to first? What concession would they make to keep IT happy, to calm down Bernard? And how would they handle Peter Billings' disappointment? What impact would this have on hearings he might one day preside over as judge? Jean's felt butterflies in her stomach as they discussed these things. Or perhaps it was the nerves of all she wanted to say but couldn't. These topics were as numerous as grains of dust in the outside air, and just as likely to dry her mouth and still her tongue. She found herself drinking more and more from his thermos, her own water making noises at her back, her stomach lurching with every landing, each number counting down toward the conclusion of their journey, an adventure that had been a complete success in so many ways. To start with, they had their sheriff, a fiery girl from the down deep who seemed every bit as confident and inspiring as Marnes had intimated. Jean saw her kind as the future of the silo, people who thought long-term, who planned, who got things done. There was precedence of sheriffs running for mayor. She thought Juliet would eventually make a fine choice. And speaking of running, the trip had fired up her own goals and ambitions. She was excited for the upcoming elections, however unopposed she might be, and had even come up with dozens of short speeches during the climb. She saw how things could run better, how she could perform her duties more diligently, and how the silo could have new life breathed into old bones. But the biggest change was whatever had grown between herself and Marnes. She had even begun to suspect, just in the last hours, that the real reason for him never taking a promotion was because of her. As deputy, there was enough space between them to contain his hope, his impossible dream of holding her. As sheriff, it couldn't happen. Too much conflict of interest, too much his immediate superior. This theory of hers contained a powerful sadness and an awe-inspiring sweetness. She squeezed his hand as she thought on this theory, and it filled her with a deep hollowness, a cramp in her gut at all he had silently sacrificed, a massive debt to live up to no matter what happened next. They approached the landing to the nursery and had no plans for stopping to see Juliet's father, to urge him to receive his daughter on the way up.
But Jean's changed her mind as she felt her bladder beg for release.
"Oh, I've got to go pretty bad," she told Marnes, embarrassed as a child to admit she couldn't hold it.
Her mouth was dry and her stomach churning from so much fluid and maybe from a little fear of the journey being over and done.
"I wouldn't mind seeing Juliet's father, either," she added.
Marnes's mustache bent up at the corners with the excuse.
"Then we should stop," he said.
The waiting room was empty, the signs reminding them to be quiet. Jean's peered through the glass partition and saw a nurse padding through the dark corridor toward her, a frown becoming a slight smile of recognition.
"Mayor," she whispered. "I'm sorry not to have wired ahead, but I was hoping to see Dr. Nichols and possibly use your restroom." "Oh, of course." She buzzed the door and waved them through. "We've had 2 deliveries since you last stopped by. Things have been crazy with this generator mess."
"Well, power holiday,"
Marnes corrected, his voice gruff and louder than theirs. The nurse shot him a look, but nodded as if duly noted. She took 2 robes from the racks and held them out, told them to leave their stuff by her desk. In the waiting room, she waved toward the benches and said she would find the doctor.
"The bathrooms are through there."
She pointed at a door, the old sign painted on its surface nearly eroded clean away.
"I'll be right back,"
Jean's told Marnes. She fought the urge to reach out and squeeze his hand, as normal as that dark and hidden habit had lately become. The bathroom was almost completely devoid of light. Jean's fumbled with an unfamiliar lock on the stall door, cursed under her breath as her stomach churned noisily, then, finally, threw the stall open and hurried to sit down. Her stomach felt like it was on fire as she relieved herself. The mixture of welcomed release and the burn of having held it too long left her unable to breathe. She went for what felt like forever, remained sitting as her legs shook uncontrollably, and realized she had pushed herself too hard on the climb up. The thought of another 20 levels mortified her, made her insides feel hollow with dread. She finished and moved over to the adjoining toilet to splash herself clean, then dried herself with one of the towels. She flushed both units to cycle the water. It all required fumbling in the darkness, unable to see and unfamiliar with the spacing and location that were second nature in her apartment and office. She staggered out of the bathroom on weak legs, wondering if she might need to stay one more night, sleep in a delivery bed, wait until the morning to make the climb to her office. She could barely feel her legs as she pulled open the door and returned to Marnes in the waiting room.
"Better?"
he asked. He sat on one of the family benches, a space left conspicuously beside him. Jean's nodded and sat heavily. She was breathing in shallow pants and wondered if he'd find her weak to admit she couldn't go any further that day.
"Jean, are you okay?"
Marnes leaned forward. He wasn't looking at her, he was looking toward the ground.
"Jean, what the hell happened?"
"Lower your voice,"
she whispered. He screamed instead.
"Doctor, nurse!"
he yelled. A form moved beyond the dusky glass of the nursery. Jean's laid her head back against the seat cushion, trying to form the words on her lips to tell him to keep it down.
"Oh, Jean, sweetheart, what did you do?"
He was holding her hand, patting the back of it. He shook her arm. Jean's just wanted to sleep. There was the slapping of footsteps running their way, lights turned up forbiddingly bright. A nurse yelled something. There was the familiar voice of Juliet's father, a doctor. He would give her a bed. He would understand this exhaustion. There was talk of blood. Someone was examining her legs. Marnes was crying, tears falling into his white mustache, peppered with black. He was shaking her shoulders, looking her in the eye.
"I'm okay,"
Jean's tried to say. She licked her lips, so dry, mouth, so damn dry. She asked for water. Marnes fumbled for his canteen, brought it to her lips, splashing water against and into her mouth. She tried to swallow but couldn't. They were stretching her out on the bench, the doctor touching her ribs, shining a light in her eyes. But things were getting darker anyway. Marnes clutched the canteen in one hand, rubbed her hair back with the other. He was blubbering. So sad for some reason, so much more energy than her. She smiled at him and reached for his hand, a miraculous effort. She held his wrist and told him that she loved him, that she had for as long as she could remember. Her mind was tired, losing its grip on her secrets, mouthing them to him as his eyes flowed with tears. His eyes, bright and wrinkled, peering down at her, then turning to the canteen in his hand. The canteen that he had carried. The water and poison meant for him. "9. The generator room was unusually crowded and eerily silent. Mechanics in worn coveralls stood 3 deep behind the railing and watched the first shift crew work. Juliet was only dimly aware of them. She was more keenly aware of the silence. She leaned over a device of her own making, a tall platform welded to the metal floor and arrayed with mirrors and tiny slits that bounced light across the room. The light shined on mirrors attached to the generator and its large dynamo, helping her get them in perfect alignment. It was the shaft between the two of them that she cared about, the long steel rod the size of a man's waist, where the power of combusting fuel was transformed into the spark of electricity. She was hoping to have the machines on either end of this rod aligned to within 1,000th of an inch, but everything they were doing was without precedent. The procedures had been hurriedly planned in all-night sessions while the backup generator was put online. Now she could only concentrate, could only hope the 18-hour shifts had been good for something, and trust in plans made back when she'd had some decent rest and could soundly think. While she guided the final placement, the chamber around her stood deathly quiet. She gave a sign, and Mark and his team tightened several of the massive bolts on the new rubber floor mounts. They were 4 days into the power holiday. The generator needed to be up and running by morning and at full power that next evening. With so much done to it, the new gaskets and seals, the polishing of cylinder shafts that had required young shadows to crawl down into the heart of the beast, Juliet was worried about it even starting up. The generator had never been fully powered down during her lifetime. Old Knox could remember it shutting itself down in an emergency once, back when he was a mere shadow, but for everyone else, the rumble was as constant and close as their own heartbeats. Juliet felt inordinate pressure for everything to work. She was the one who had come up with the idea to do a refit. She calmed herself with reassurances that it was the right thing to do, and that the worst that could happen now was that the holiday would get extended until they sorted out all the kinks. That was much better than a catastrophic failure years from now. Mark signaled that the bolts were secure, the lock nuts tightened down. Juliet jumped off her homemade platform and strolled over to the generator to join him. It was difficult to walk casually with so many eyes on her. She couldn't believe this rowdy crew, this extended and dysfunctional family of hers, could be so perfectly silent. It was like they were all holding their breath, wondering if the crushing schedule of the last few days was going to be for naught. "You ready?" she asked Mark. He nodded, wiping his hands on a filthy rag that always seemed to be draped over his shoulder. Juliet checked her watch. The sight of its second hand ticking around in its constant path comforted her. Whenever she had doubts about something working, she looked at her wrist. Not to see the time, but to see a thing she had fixed. A repair so intricate and impossible, one that had taken years of cleaning and setting parts almost too small to see, that it made her current task, whatever it was, feel small by comparison.
"We on schedule?" Mark asked, grinning.
"We're doing fine." She nodded to the control room. Whispers began to stir through the crowd as they realized the restart was imminent. Dozens of them pulled sound protection from their necks and settled the muffs over their ears. Juliet and Mark joined Shirley in the control room. "How's it going?" Juliet asked the second shift foreman, a young woman, small but fiery.
"Oh, golden,"
Shirley said as she continued to make adjustments, zeroing out all the corrections that had built up over the years. They were starting from the ground up. None of the patches and fixes of old to disguise any new symptoms. A fresh start. "Oh, we're good to go," she said. She backed away from the controls and moved to stand near her husband. The gesture was transparent. Leaving the controls, this was Juliet's project. Perhaps the last thing she would ever try and fix in the down deep of mechanical. She would have the honor and the full responsibility of firing the generator up. Juliet stood over the control board, looking down at knobs and dials that she could locate in utter darkness. It was hard to believe that this phase of her life was over, that some new one was about to begin. The thought of traveling to the uptop frightened her more than this project could. The idea of leaving her friends and family, of dealing with politics, did not taste as sweet to her as the sweat and grease on her lips. But at least she had allies up there. If people like Jean's and Marne's were able to get by, to survive, she figured she'd be okay. With a trembling hand, more from exhaustion than nerves, Juliet engaged the starter motor. There was a loud whine as a small electrical engine tried to get the massive diesel generator moving. It seemed to be taking forever, but Juliet had no idea what normal sounded like. Mark stood by the door, propping it open so they could better hear any shouts to abort. He glanced over at Juliet as she continued to hold the ignition, creases of worry in his brow as the starter whined and groaned in the next room. Someone outside waved both arms, trying to signal her through the glass.
Shut it off,
Mark said. Shirley hurried over toward the control panel to help. Juliet let go of the ignition and reached for the kill switch, but she stopped herself from pressing it. There was a noise outside, a powerful hum. She thought she could feel it through the floor, but not like the vibration of old.
"It's already running!"
someone yelled.
"It's already running!"
Mark said, laughing. The mechanics outside were cheering. Someone pulled off their ear protection and hurled the muffs up into the air. Juliet realized the starter motor was louder than the rebuilt generator, that she'd been holding the ignition even as it had already started and continued to run. Shirley and Mark hugged one another. Juliet checked the temps and pressures on all the zeroed gauges and saw little to adjust, but she wouldn't be sure until it warmed up. Her throat constricted with emotion. The release of so much pressure, work crew had already started and continued to run. Shirley and Mark hugged one another. Juliet checked the temps and pressures on all the zeroed gauges and saw little to adjust, but she wouldn't be sure until it warmed up. Her throat constricted with emotion. The release of so much pressure, work crews were leaping over the railing to crowd around the rebuilt beast. Some who rarely visited the generator room were reaching out to touch it, almost with reverent awe. Juliet left the control room to watch them, to listen to the sound of a perfectly working machine, of gears in alignment. She stood behind the railing, hands on a steel bar that used to rattle and dance while the generator labored, and watched an unlikely celebration take place in a normally avoided workspace. The hum was magnificent. Power without dread. The culmination of so much hurried labor and planning. The success gave her a new confidence for what lay ahead, for what lay above. She was in such fine spirits and so fixated on the powerful and improved machines that she didn't notice the young porter hurry into the room, his face ashen, his chest swelling with the deep gulps of a long and frantic run. She barely noticed the way the news traveled from mouth to mouth throughout the room, spreading among the mechanics until fear and sadness registered in their eyes. It wasn't until the celebration died completely, the room falling into a different sort of quiet, one studded with sobs and gasps of disbelief, of grown men wailing, that Juliet knew something was amiss. Something had happened. A great and powerful thing had fallen out of alignment, and it had nothing to do with her generator.